It's somewhere in France, late September, 1944. The night is cold and damp, rain tapping against canvas that shouldn't be there. A handful of men are spread across a field just a few miles from the German lines, working in near darkness. They're inflating tanks, not building them, not assembling them, inflating them like birthday balloons, but 30 feet long, rubber and air, canvas stretched over frames. From a distance, in the murky pre-dawn light, they look real enough. Rows of Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, supply trucks, an entire armored division, 30,000 strong on paper. Except there aren't 30,000 men here. There are maybe 1,100, and most of them are artists. How do you convince an enemy army that you're a massive armored threat when you're really just a traveling show of con men with rubber props and recording equipment? This is the legend you might have heard. A mysterious phantom army that single-handedly fooled the Nazis with Hollywood magic. Inflatable tanks that won battles. Sound effects that saved thousands of lives. Artists turned soldiers who painted their way across Europe, bamboozling German intelligence at every turn with nothing but creativity and audacity. It sounds almost too good to be true, like something from a spy novel. A secret weapon nobody knew about for decades. And like most legends, the truth is more complicated, more human, and in some ways, more interesting. Let's go back to 1944. The Allies are pushing into Europe and they have a problem. Deception works. The British proved that in North Africa and in the run-up to D-Day, where entire phantom armies convinced Hitler that the invasion would come at Calais instead of Normandy. But the Americans don't have their own deception units. So in January 1944, the U.S. Army activates the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. It's an unusual unit from the start. They recruit artists and designers, men who went to art school instead of boot camp, sound engineers from radio stations, young men who know more about perspective and acoustics than they do about rifles. The idea is simple on paper. Create a mobile tactical deception unit that can simulate entire divisions, draw enemy attention away from real operations, make the Germans think American forces are somewhere they're not. The unit has about 1,100 men divided into specialized companies. There's a visual deception company equipped with inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery. Props that weigh maybe 100 pounds each but look convincing from a few hundred yards away or from the air. There's a sonic deception company with massive speakers mounted on half-tracks, capable of blasting pre-recorded sounds of tank engines, troop movements, and engineering work across miles of countryside. And there's a signals company running fake radio traffic, mimicking the communication patterns of real armored or infantry divisions, so German radio intercept teams will think they're tracking a genuine unit. On their own, each element might seem like a parlor trick, but combined, visual, sonic, radio, they could create the illusion of an entire phantom division. They ship out to Europe in the spring of 1944, just after D-Day. Their first operations are in Normandy and Brittany. One early mission has them impersonating elements of the 2nd Armored Division near Saint-Lô, while the real division moves to attack elsewhere. The Ghost Army soldiers set up their inflatable tanks in fields, string camouflage netting, paint unit markings on jeeps, and start broadcasting radio chatter. At night, the Sonic Company plays recordings of tanks moving into position, the growl of engines, the clank of treads, orders shouted over the noise. Meanwhile, a few men in the right uniforms drive into nearby towns, flash the 2nd Armored shoulder patches in cafes, talk just loud enough to be overheard. It's theater. The goal isn't to fool someone standing 10 feet away. It's to fool reconnaissance planes, distant observers, and intelligence analysts piecing together scattered reports. Does it work? Sometimes brilliantly, Sometimes it's impossible to say. In Brittany, they run an operation near Brest in September. The mission is to make the Germans think a major assault is coming from one direction, while the real attack comes from another. The Ghost Army sets up a fake headquarters, inflates dummy artillery, runs their sonic deceptions at night. According to some accounts, German forces shifted troops and opened fire on empty fields. But the historical record is murky. Operational reports from the time are often vague about direct impact, and it's difficult to know whether German decisions were based on the deception or on other intelligence. What's clear is that the Ghost Army operated close to the front lines, sometimes within artillery range, and that the illusion had to survive at least casual scrutiny. Viersen, in early 1945, offers a clearer picture. The Allies are preparing to cross the Rhine, and they need to hide the buildup of the actual assault force. The Ghost Army is sent to simulate the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions in a different sector, trying to pull German attention away from the real crossing site. For days, they set up dummy camps, inflate tanks, broadcast the sounds of bridge construction and heavy vehicle movement, and run elaborate fake radio nets. They even send small patrols forward to be seen and reported. At one point, German artillery starts shelling the dummy positions, proof that someone on the other side believed the ruse. The Rhine crossing succeeds with relatively light resistance at the actual site, and some analysts credit the Ghost Army's deception with helping to draw German defenders out of position. But the illusion is only as good as the context it's embedded in. The Ardennes, winter of 1944, is different and darker. The Germans launched their surprise counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and suddenly, the Ghost Army is operating in a collapsing situation. Their mission shifts: simulate strength where there is none. Try to convince German reconnaissance that the Allied lines are more solid than they actually are. They set up decoys under fire, run their sonic operations in freezing conditions, broadcast radio traffic for units that are scattered or barely holding together. It's a desperate play. The equipment is breaking down in the cold. The inflatable tanks are hard to manage in the snow and mud. And the men are scared. There's a very real chance they could be overrun. One veteran would later recall the surrealness of standing next to a rubber tank in the dark, hearing actual German artillery in the distance, knowing that if the enemy pushed a little further, they'd discover the whole thing was a sham. What happens if your fake division is the only thing standing between the Germans and a real breakthrough? Who are these men, really? They're not commandos. They're kids, most of them, barely out of their teens, who happen to be good at drawing or building sets or tinkering with sound equipment. Some had been studying at places like the Pratt Institute or Cooper Union before the war. Now they're soldiers, sort of. They carry rifles, but they rarely fire them. Their weapon is misdirection. And there's something deeply strange about that. War is supposed to be about strength, firepower, courage. The Ghost Army fights with rubber and recordings. Some of the men struggle with it. There's a moral ambiguity to what they're doing. They're not saving lives by charging a machine gun nest. They're saving lives by lying convincingly. And if the lie fails, real soldiers elsewhere could pay the price. One artist who served in the unit later described it as feeling like a combat con artist. You put on a show, and if you do it well enough, maybe the enemy buys it. If not, people die. The visual deception is painstaking work. The inflatable tanks are made from rubberized fabric stitched and glued into the rough shape of a Sherman or a tank destroyer. Inflated, they have the right silhouette from a distance or from the air, but up close, they're obviously fake. So the men have to position them carefully, use camouflage netting, scatter real vehicles among the dummies to add authenticity. They paint bumper markings, dust the rubber with dirt to dull the shine, park them at angles that match how a real tank company would deploy. Some of the artists sketched the surrounding terrain first, figuring out sight lines, where German observers might be, what the illusion needs to look like from those vantage points. It's not just blowing up a balloon and hoping for the best. It's stage design under combat conditions. The sonic deception is even more technical. The Ghost Army has these massive speakers, 500-pound amplifiers that can project sound for miles. They have libraries of recordings, tanks moving, trucks in convoy, engineers hammering bridge sections, even the clink of mess kits and casual soldier chatter. The sound engineers have to choose the right recording for the scenario, figure out the direction and volume so it sounds like a real unit on the move or setting up camp. They run these operations at night, usually, when sound carries further and visibility is low, so the enemy can't easily verify what they're hearing. In some cases, they coordinate with the visual team, dummy tanks in position during the day, then at night the sounds of those _, moving or idling. It's a multimedia con. Play the wrong recording, or play it too loud or from the wrong location, and the whole thing falls apart. The radio deception is the most invisible, but maybe the most important. The signals company doesn't just broadcast random chatter. They study the communication patterns of real divisions, how often units check in, what kind of code words and procedures they use, the rhythm and volume of traffic. Then they mimic it, creating a fake radio signature for a division that doesn't exist or is somewhere else entirely. German intelligence units are listening constantly, trying to map Allied positions by tracking radio traffic. If the Ghost Army can make their Phantom Division sound real on the airwaves, that fake division gets plotted on enemy maps, and German commanders make decisions based on a fiction. It's psychological warfare at a distance. The enemy never sees you, never hears your loudspeakers, but they quote to you're there because their radios say so. By the spring of 1945, the Ghost Army has run over 20 operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They've impersonated multiple divisions, staged fake offensives, covered real troop movements, tried to keep the German command off balance. How effective were they? The honest answer is, it's complicated. In some operations, like the Rhine crossing at Viersen, there's evidence that the deception influenced German deployments. In others, it's less clear. The Ghost Army didn't win battles on their own. They were a supporting act, an attempt to tilt the odds, to create confusion and hesitation in the enemy's decision-making. Sometimes it worked spectacularly. Sometimes the Germans didn't buy it, or didn't react the way the Allies hoped. And sometimes the operational context was so chaotic that it's impossible to say what impact the deception had. What we do know is that the unit operated close enough to the front to be in real danger. They were targeted by artillery and occasional sniper fire. Some of their positions were discovered, and the men knew that if the deception failed badly enough, if the Germans realized they were facing a phantom and pushed through, real Allied units could be caught off guard. The stakes were high, even if the weapons were fake. For decades after the war, almost nobody knew the Ghost Army existed. The unit's operations were classified. The men who served in it were told not to talk about what they'd done, and most of them didn't. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that veterans started to share their stories, and researchers began piecing together the history from declassified documents and interviews. Museums like the National World War II Museum and the National Archives started collecting the unit's materials, sketches, photographs, operational reports, the soldiers' letters and diaries. The Ghost Army Legacy Project was formed to preserve the story and honor the men who served. And slowly, the public started to learn about this strange, secretive unit. As the story emerged, so did the mythology. Popular accounts latched on to the most dramatic elements: inflatable tanks, Hollywood-style trickery, artists saving the day with paintbrushes and sound effects. Some sources describe the Ghost Army as if they almost single-handedly turned the tide in Europe, a forgotten secret weapon that deserves legendary status. And yes, what they did was remarkable. 1,000 artists and engineers running mobile deceptions across a battlefield is genuinely strange and creative military history. But the legend sometimes oversimplifies the reality. It makes the deceptions sound more consistently successful than they may have been. It glosses over the times when the illusions didn't work, or when the Germans didn't react as expected. And it can obscure the very real human experience of the men involved. The fear, the uncertainty, the strange mix of artistry and danger. The documented history is more measured. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops ran tactical deceptions in support of larger operations. They used visual decoys, sonic effects, and fake radio traffic to simulate the presence of divisions that weren't there, or to mask the movements of real units. They operated in active combat zones, often at significant risk. Some of their operations appear to have been effective in drawing enemy attention or causing confusion. Others are harder to evaluate. The myth of the Ghost Army as an all-powerful phantom force is appealing, but the real story of young men doing a strange and dangerous job with imperfect tools under uncertain conditions is more human and, in its own way, more compelling. So why do we love this story? Maybe because it's the perfect metaphor. The idea that you can fight a war not just with tanks and bombs, but with creativity and misdirection. That art can be a weapon. That a lie, told well enough, can save lives. There's something deeply appealing about the underdog con artist, the clever trick that outsmarts brute force. We want to believe that ingenuity can triumph over violence, that a few hundred artists with rubber props can change the course of history. And to some extent they did. The Ghost Army existed. They ran real operations. They took real risks. But the story, like one of their inflatable tanks, sometimes looks more impressive from a distance than it does up close. What the Ghost Army really tells us is something about the nature of modern war. By the mid-20th century, warfare wasn't just about who had more soldiers or bigger guns. It was about information, perception, psychology. If you could make the enemy think you were stronger than you were, or make them look in the wrong direction at the critical moment, that was as valuable as an extra division. The Ghost Army was an experiment in that kind of warfare, an attempt to weaponize illusion. And in that sense, their legacy isn't just the specific operations they ran in 1944 and 1945. It's the idea that deception, carefully crafted and boldly executed, has a place on the battlefield. That wars are fought in the mind as much as on the ground. The men of the Ghost Army went home after the war. Most of them went back to being artists, designers, engineers, quiet lives for the most part. They carried the secret for decades until it was finally safe to speak. And now their story is out there. Part museum exhibit, part legend, part historical footnote. They were the Phantom Army, real enough to serve, strange enough to remember, and just elusive enough, even now, to keep us guessing about where the truth ends and the myth begins.